This is how we learn. We learn by doing. Would you like to start the stream with a discussion of the other side of the issue? Now we've got now we've got tactical headshot. So we will make that a little bit
Nice.
bigger. Yeah.
Nice.
Now we got picture in picture. Very exciting.
Cool.
All right.
So I just want to give a little bit of background in terms of what authority I am speaking from. I am an amateur when it comes to sort of birth control, amateur in the sense that I am someone who is very, very passionate about it, but I'm also self-educated. However, I do my undergrad has a minor in sexuality studies, and I did my graduate work with female sexuality, and that involves a lot of birth control talk and stuff. But a lot of my education has just been through reading the medical literature, through Google Scholar, and all of that when I had access to it through my school. So anything that I say, please do your own Google Scholar search, and I would trust Google Scholar over other sources because there's a lot of misinformation out there.
Yes, fair enough. Google Scholar is I use it all the time for work as patent literature. So it's a very valuable resource, and it's better than random comments on blogs, because random comments on blogs can be wrong. I guess Google Scholar can be wrong too, but at least it's more likely to be vetted. All right, so let's start this discussion from the beginning, ab initio. So we'll make that legal speaking. So we are going to be discussing with my friend Tactical Bra here. We're going to be discussing this item of news where there was a pharmacist who wanted to deny birth control medication, morning after pill, to a person with a prescription, and denied the person the prescription and called other pharmacies in the area to ask that they also deny the prescription. Am I getting the factual predicate correct?
Yes, so the woman had a condom break. She needed emergency contraception, got her prescription, so she called it in. They said that they would be able to fill it. I'm not sure if she spoke to the pharmacist when she called in, because there are multiple people at the pharmacy part of the store, right? So you can have a pharmacist assistant or just a general cashier that goes like, yeah, sure, we can fill that. We have it in stock or whatnot. But that person might not be the pharmacist. Then she went in and the pharmacist said, I can't do it for my own personal reasons. And just told her all of the reasons why like she couldn't get it filled. And they said that another pharmacist was gonna come in later, but because of the snowstorm, they might not make it.
Mm-hmm.
Then sort of called her back and said like, oh, well, we called the other pharmacies and they can't handle it either. She double checked with the other pharmacy and they said, we did speak to someone from your pharmacy and we indicated that we could fill it.
Mm.
So come on in. So that's the part of the story that pushes my buttons.
Yeah, fair enough, because they're actively misleading, lying to someone. That's not good. So, yeah, fair enough. That makes sense. So the first thing that comes to mind when uh, the scientific issues are not the same thing as the legal issues, or not the same thing as the moral issues. And I felt like some people tend to conflagrate these things. Now, you can be scientifically misinformed, because you had earlier said that the morning after pill does not do anything except prevent ovulation. And that was not my prior understanding. I understood that was its principal effect, but I understood prior to your saying it that it had effects, potential effects as an abortifacient. How do you pronounce that? Abortifactant?
Abortifacient.
Yeah. Abort-
Abortifacient. So it's almost like efficient, but
yeah,
it's
abortifacient.
abortifacient.
So that perhaps is a misunderstanding on my part. So you can be scientifically misinformed, but I think you can be scientifically fully informed and still come to, because the science doesn't like inform a conclusion as to the moral result that should occur. For example, you could say, well, when does death occur? When is a person dead? And so you can have a lot of scientific uh, elements of that. It could a person's not breathing, their heart has stopped beating, a brain isn't functioning, or there could be other signs, and then you say for how long does that need to be true. And so like just because like you have certain indicators, that doesn't necessarily dictate the result, it seems to me, in terms of like, because the question ultimately is not really a medical question, it's ultimately a legal question informed by a doctor who can testify, certain things happen and we have certain abilities to bring people back or not at certain rates of success. And so here's some evidence, and it goes to inform an ultimate philosophical or legal conclusion. So it ultimately is not medical. Medicine can tell you what certain things are, but not what they mean. That seems to me to be like the first thing. Does that seem reasonable to you?
Yeah. I think that there's, yeah, a lot of approaches that you can take. So the moral approach, I have less of an issue with the pharmacist being morally against it, because you can be a Catholic pharmacist and be against birth control that prevents ovulation,
Right.
right? So I'm not gonna say that there's no way that Catholics can be pharmacists. My and so the moral I separate from the employment law, which I separate from the professional obligations of the pharmacist, which I then sort of separate from the science
Yes.
behind everything. Yeah.
But I do. My point was I do take some exception at the idea that anyone who comes differently down on these questions is necessarily ill-informed. I think you can be fully informed and come down differently on some of these questions. Um, but yeah, so in terms of what the law allows for, some states and some jurisdictions allow for a pharmacist to not do this on personal objections on basis of a religious accommodation. Um, I would suggest that lying is probably not a good idea, but you don't necessarily have to help. And my knowledge of medicine, for example, for doctors, it's my understanding that doctors can refuse to treat patients in non-emergency situations. They can just refuse a patient full stop and say, I won't treat you, period. They can say, I won't do certain things, I won't give you certain treatments. Um, Perhaps that's a good idea. For example, to the degree that opiates are still legal prescriptions, a doctor might reasonably think that there's an opiate problem, and so just flat out refuse to give anyone opiates. They will say we'll find other solutions, or we just won't do this. So, like, I can imagine a doctor refusing to do certain things on philosophical grounds that it's for the better. And the physician's code says, for example, first do no harm. So it doesn't like require you to do anything. It requires you to not harm people. It requires you not to take steps to harm people. It's an admonition against action, but it's not a statement against inaction. First do no harm doesn't say anything about inaction. It just says don't do stuff that will cause harm. So if I take that oath and say, okay, well, I won't do anything that harms you, but I don't have to do anything for you, period. And that's not part of that oath, it seems to me.
So the other side of the coin would be that um, doctors we expect doctors to be willing to treat people that are in need, and that any objection that they have to treating a person should not be based off of a protected class. And so, or a protected class without a medical justification. So, like you know, um, if I'm an OBGYN and I'm only really qualified to be treating women, and then a guy comes in who does not have like female reproductive organs or anything, then I might be able to say, like, look, I specialize in women. Go find yourself a urologist. Go find yourself someone in
Yeah.
specializes in your junk. But so that's kind of sex discrimination, but it's also justifiable medically. If somebody had a religious issue touching, I don't know, like black people or something, I would not expect that to fly.
Yeah. And fair enough. And as we've pointed out in other streams, at least as far as state action is concerned, you differentiate on the current law on race based versus sex. Race based discrimination on the basis of state, if it's the state, is strict scrutiny, and on the basis of gender or basis of sex, it's normally intermediate scrutiny. So for state action, to the extent that this can be viewed as state action because it's a state license or other implications, then normally sex issues are reviewed under intermediate scrutiny on the basis that men and women are different. And men and women alone have these abilities to carry a child. And so there are certain things that are solely implicated by women because of the biological realities. So, you can separate it based on that. It's not that you're discriminating against women per se. It's that you're discriminating against doing certain things that only apply to women, which, is a bit of a logical, it's a bit of A therefore B or B therefore A. I'm not discriminating against women because they do this. I'm discriminating on this and therefore it impacts women. So it's like which is coming first in sort of the causal chain of the reasoning can be a point of differentiation.
Yeah, which is an interesting legal point from the woman's perspective that was trying to get this emergency contraception, because she is claiming sex discrimination
Mm-hmm.
because she's in a situation that only women, or I should say, like people with female reproductive organs, that like uteruses and vaginas and stuff face. And
Just for the record, I'm fully
I,
comfortable with you describing those as women on my channel. But
I understand.
you can describe it in any way that informs your discussion. It's fine by me.
Yeah. So I I I get that in terms of a religious terms of a religious reason to not dispense medications, I'm not sure there's an equivalent for men.
No, probably not. None that comes immediate to mind. I mean, until they invent male birth control, there would be nothing parallel. Um,
Yeah, I mean, like if you're getting painkillers for a vasectomy or something, but then again, like the pharmacist shouldn't have a religious objection to
to the
painkillers.
painkiller, right? Yeah. So
Yeah.
until some sort of male birth control, it would be hard to find a parallel situation. And also, like, when it comes to Catholic doctrine, and I'm by no means an expert because I've never been Catholic, but my understanding of this when it comes to like abortion, for example, is Catholics differentiate on primary effects versus secondary effects. So if the issue is a woman comes to you who is pregnant and needs some sort of medical procedure, some sort of radiation treatment for some sort of aggressive cancer, and the radiation treatment would help treat the cancer, but is also extremely likely or even certain to terminate the pregnancy. Is that okay? And Catholic doctrine, as I understand it, says yes, that's okay because it's a secondary effect. It's not your goal or purpose. It's a secondary impact. So you're not doing anything morally wrong by treating the disease, even though it has the secondary impacts. So,
Well,
as
I
I
wouldn't
understand,
say nothing morally wrong. Okay, my husband comes from a very Catholic family,
fair enough.
and I did grow up very religious.
You feel free to
So
correct me. I could be full of crap. I try to admit my own
well,
ignorance.
I'm trying to remember who it was that came up with the philosophical sort of flow chart of
Hmm.
morality. Was it Aquinas or Augustine? But basically, that it is it is acceptable to commit a sin if committing that sin is an effort to prevent a greater sin from happening. And so you this is where, giving a woman an abortion in order to save her life, or giving a woman medical treatment which could result in a miscarriage to save her life, is justifiable. It's still something to be sad about, it's still something to feel torn about, but you are saving one life instead of having two die.
Right.
So that's the idea.
Fair enough. I probably overstated my case by suggesting it was without moral weight. So I appreciate the correction. Yes. So, like,
Although
someone,
I will say that there's like a billion Christians in the world,
yes,
more than a billion Christians, and Catholics make up like a huge portion of that. So there is a huge amount of debate within Catholicism and what the Pope says. There are plenty of Catholics that don't regurgitate everything that the Pope says.
fair enough.
Like there is diversity there.
I understand. Yes, when you have a billion of anything, it's going to be hard to be homogenous, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So your point is well taken, but to the extent that people were pointing out in Leonard's chat that pharmacists would have to necessarily deny other medications because they might have impacts on pregnancy, my point was to say that that may not necessarily flow because those other medications' primary impacts are not with relation to pregnancy, even though the secondary impacts may be. So, to the extent that that is a moral guide for you, and that would be a
Um,
point of note.
yeah. So one of the issues that I have with that is that there are medications or devices out there that have both um, abortion or preventing a fertilized egg from implanting kind of effects, and but they also have other uses that are unrelated to that. So when you have misoprostol, um, it um, it like causes uterine contractions, which can cause a miscarriage, but it also like softens the cervix. So I had to have some before I got my IUD inserted, and the doctor had recommended that for me. It had nothing to do with abortion. I wasn't pregnant, but I also would have been hella pissed if the pharmacist wouldn't dispense it to me,
Right.
because some women it's used in combination with other drugs to induce a miscarriage or to have an abortion.
Your point is exceptionally well taken, and I agree with your point. And I would agree that many medications in this space have more than one impact. So I totally accept your point. And like the only analogy that comes to mind, and I don't know that's necessarily a great analogy, so you'll forgive me if it's not the best analogy ever. But I was thinking like, what else could I compare this to? Like where knowledge of what's going on might be material. And an example that came to mind was a person going to buy ammunition for a firearm. Like the ammunition itself is morally neutral, right? It can be used for a lot of morally arguably good purposes and morally neutral purposes and certainly morally bad purposes. And so, like, to the extent that a person is coming for the ammunition slash prescription that has multiple uses and the pharmacist doesn't know more, then I would argue there's no moral wrong in dispensing. To the extent that they have actual knowledge for some reason that it's going to be used for harm of others, which gets to the philosophical underlying point of whether that qualifies as harm of others, whether or not, the fetus slash embryo slash egg slash whatever qualifies as another for the purposes of this analogy. But to the extent they have actual knowledge of that, then in the same way that a person who sells ammo could deny giving ammo to someone because they have reason to believe that person might be harming others, and we would want them to deny it for that reason. To the extent that would be proper there, then it seems by parallel, to the extent this parallel makes any sense, that the pharmacists, to the extent they have actual knowledge, would deny because of actual knowledge of the harm of others as they view that term, harm of others. So if anything I just said didn't make sense, feel free to, disagree with me. It's the best I came up with.
Yeah, so at this point I'm torn a little bit, which is something that you had brought up, right at the beginning, which is, are the religious objections, do they make sense with the science? So in terms of if the religious objection is that, so for like a lot of Christians, they don't have a problem with preventing ovulation. They don't have a problem with um, condoms, because basically like life for them begins at
Mm-hmm.
fertilization,
Right.
which happens in the fallopian tubes, and it happens within 24 hours after ovulation. The egg is only receptive to sperm for 24 hours, and then it takes 5 to 6 days for the fertilized egg to get down into the uterus and implant, and then it takes about another 7 days before it will show up positive on a home pregnancy test. So there are three points in which you can prevent the pregnancy. So
Mm-hmm.
you can prevent the egg and sperm from meeting, which a lot of Christians are comfortable with. You can prevent a fertilized egg from implanting, and that some people are comfortable with, some aren't. And then once it's sort of implanted, then you can cause a miscarriage or an abortion.
Mm-hmm.
And then a lot of Christians are much less comfortable with that.
Right.
Um, and so most birth control works to prevent the egg and the sperm from meeting. So this either works through for preventing ovulation, or it works by changing the cervical mucus to not allow the sperm to pass, which is a really fun thing to say around men because it kind of all like, ugh, like mucus.
Yeah. It's not the
But
not the most
basically,
sexy topic I've ever heard in my life.
I
Yeah.
know, right? But that's another way that it works. Problem is, so hormonal birth control, although it works, and when I talk about hormonal birth control, I'm talking about combination that has both estrogen and progesterone.
Mm-hmm.
The primary way that it works is by preventing ovulation, but a secondary way it works is by changing the cervix so that the sperm can't get in.
Mm-hmm.
A third way it works is by thinning the uterine lining, so the endometrium, the comfy bed that the egg is going to implant in. And in humans, you need to have a really thick, comfy endometrium there in order to accept the egg. And if it's, too thin, or if it's, barely there, there's nothing for that egg to grab hold to. It's not going to get nourished, and you're not going to get implantation. The thing is that we don't know 100% what percentage of people are having effective birth control for which of these mechanisms.
Fair enough.
So we know that it's really good at preventing ovulation when you take the pill all the time. But a lot of people don't take the pill properly. And so they might be relying on some of the secondary or tertiary ways that it works to not get pregnant, and we wouldn't know. So if you are really, really, really horribly against a fertilized egg from implanting, then you're basically only got condoms,
Mm-hmm.
because all the other birth control methods are going to also work by thinning the uterine lining,
Right.
which could prevent a fertilized egg from implanting. So that's one issue there. So does the science back up the ability to, for people who believe that that would be a form of abortion, or sorry, a sin to have the fertilized egg not implant? Can they prescribe any hormonal birth control? And then second of all, a misunderstanding that Plan B would cause a miscarriage, because it doesn't. And that's because, implantation actually happens like a week after fertilization. So it's, um, and it's also one of the reasons why Ella, for example, is only good. It's most effective within 3 days of the risky sex, but it's no good after 5 days, because if there was a fertilized egg, like it's already implanted. Like
Right.
there's, um, and 5 days is about the longest that sperm survives in the body. So after that point, like if you haven't ovulated yet, it's not gonna make a difference.
Yeah,
Um,
fair enough. But so
yeah.
like there's some uncertainty around some of these issues too, and to the extent that you're taking the position that certain triggers are when there's a second life and interest,
Mm-hmm.
then it becomes a problem because like the classic statement, or one of the classic statements from people who are pro-choice, is my body, my choice. And some of the pro-life rejoinder is, yeah, exactly so. It's like your body, your choice, but that presupposes one of the things we're trying to debate. It's like whose body is being impacted by this? Whose rights are being impacted by this decision? And it's not as simple, or it shouldn't be as simple as turning to the current state of the law and saying that they're not within a protected class because the law has been wrong about such questions before. The law has before
Mm-hmm.
said certain entities are not people, within the meaning of the law, and people objected to those. And I don't think retreating to the law and saying, but the law says, was a satisfactory defense at that point. And so, just because the law says certain things, and in terms of what entities do or do not qualify as people, doesn't seem like it can
Mhm.
be dispositive because the law has been wrong. So the law might be wrong now, at least in principle. So like trying to figure, and if you like think, if you really believe like, well, the law is wrong, the law is defining certain entities out of personhood that it shouldn't, then it seems like your only recourse as a moral actor is to not participate in anything that would take what you view as a human life, regardless of what the law says. It's like, if I think it's a human life, then I'm not going to help because that would be accessory, and I don't want to be an accessory. So it seems like a consistent philosophical position as far as I can tell.
I mean, but mm, okay, because I want to go further and further down the rabbit hole, so I'm going to try to bring it back to um,
I'm
some of
happy to I'm happy
the
to bring
legal
this discussion
questions.
anywhere that you want. If you think I'm taking this off the route, if you think I'm taking this down somewhere it doesn't, I'm happy to
Okay,
refrain.
because what this brings up in my mind is recently there was, I believe it was Ohio, there was a legislator that tried to say that
Yes.
if a woman had an ectopic pregnancy, that would be that the fertilized egg implants in the fallopian tube rather than in the uterus.
So that thick lining isn't
That
always necessary either, huh?
now it's not always necessary, but it definitely helps.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, but when the egg implants in the fallopian tube, that is a life-threatening situation. You can die
Right.
from that.
Yes.
You have internal bleeding and hemorrhaging.
Yes.
It also means that you lose half your fertility because if the fallopian tube bursts, then that is no good for getting pregnant. Like that ovary is now going to, instead of like the sperm and the egg are not going to be able to meet in that fallopian tube again because you've blown up the tunnel.
Right.
Right, the tunnel doesn't exist anymore. It's not going to work.
Right.
So you lose half of your fertility. Um, it is and it is treat it as fast as you can, because as I said, like the time between there's a gap between implantation and when you can detect it with a home pregnancy test, and often women are only aware that it's an ectopic pregnancy by the time they're in a medical emergency. That is, they
Yes.
are having serious pain, and it's because their fallopian tube is bursting and they could die. This legislator said that an attempt should be made to reimplant the egg in the uterus, which is not a medical procedure that exists. It's not
Yes.
something that happens. It's not possible. You have to disrupt the blood flow in order to remove the embryo, and by disrupting the blood flow, um, you're it's dead,
Yeah,
right?
it
It's
makes
not.
sense.
Yeah. So then when doctors and OBGYNs and everybody are like, throw their hands up in the air and say, there is absolutely no situation in which this is going to result in a viable pregnancy. It was never viable in the first place, and we cannot implant. What the heck are you writing into this bill? And the legislator kind of responded, well, I'm not a doctor. What do you expect
Yes.
from me? Which makes me grind my teeth.
It makes me grind my teeth too. I'm with you, fully on board. I take immediate exception to someone not understanding the issue they're trying to regulate. Whether regardless of the issues, like if you don't understand it, if you don't understand what you're doing, if you don't understand the facts, like I very much don't like a lot of legislation or regulation attempt that comes out of Democratic hands when it comes to firearms. Mostly because it seems to me they don't understand the thing they're regulating. Like they don't understand the first thing about what they're talking about, and it endlessly irritates me. So I share your irritation fully that this legislature is trying to regulate something that they don't understand. They didn't have the factual knowledge that you just so wonderfully elucidated about how this is not possible, this is not a thing. They're trying to regulate something that they don't understand. So I join you in
Yeah.
condemning that particular bill because it's literally stupid. It's ill informed.
Yes, it is
It is
literally,
literally
with the
stupid.
literal definition of literal,
Stupid. Yes.
stupid.
Yes. It is from a place of complete ignorance of the facts, and so I don't like stupid. I like informed debate.
And what I think really gets me is that this is not just a shout out to pro-life or conservative or pro-pregnancy or whatever um, constituency, that this creates a mistrust between women and their doctors, that there are women who, many of whom could be pro-life, who have had an ectopic pregnancy, lost it, where maybe it was a planned pregnancy and they were really sad. Maybe they felt like they failed as a woman because
Yes,
the pregnancy
yes.
didn't go as planned. And now they're like, why didn't the doctor offer this to me? Well, of
Mm,
course they should make a law to make it so that the doctors have to offer this to me. It's like, it doesn't exist.
yes.
So that irritates me. And of course, getting back to the story at hand, it irritates me that the pharmacist has this belief that Ella or Plan B, um, induced an abortion, or that it prevents a fertilized egg from
Yeah.
implanting, when that's not their mechanism of action.
To
I'm
the
a
extent I didn't read the complaint. To the extent that was why he was making that judgment, then I would
Yes,
understand the
yes.
complaint, because he's making a judgment that is contra the facts. So that is
Now,
ill-informed and literally stupid again.
I was very upset with him. And then I went to the Plan B website, and god damn it, on the Plan B website, right on its front page, it says that it stops the fertilization of an egg and that it stops the implantation of a fertilized egg. And I'm like, fuck you, Plan B.
Well,
Like, that's
then it's
not
that
what.
that it's a little hard to be upset at the pharmacist for being ill-informed. And then
I know.
with all due respect to you, Tactical, I'm somewhat inclined to to trust Plan B's description of their own medication over yours. So I'm
Okay.
like, are you
No,
are you sure your description's accurate? Because the
right?
makers of the drug seem to disagree with you, Tactical.
I
I
know.
think we
And
might
so then
rely on
I
that to
questioned
some degree.
myself. I
Yeah.
questioned myself. And so then I'm like, no, no, I swear I've read studies. And so then I did a Google search on the effectiveness of hormonal emergency contraception after ovulation. And I came up with multiple studies that said that if you take it before ovulation, as confirmed by blood draws, so
Mm-hmm.
endocrinology, where they look at your hormones to determine if you're pre or post ovulation, then pre ovulation, it is effective. Post ovulation, there is no difference in the number of pregnancies that result in terms of like expected versus whatever. So your null hypothesis is that that Ella does nothing, and you look at the number of pregnancies that you would expect if the women didn't take the pill, and there's no difference post ovulation. So whether you take the pill or not doesn't matter post ovulation. I found multiple studies that showed this. In fact, I couldn't find any studies that said that it was effective post ovulation. So the only studies that show a difference are when they use the calendar method to determine ovulation.
Yeah.
So they ask women, what was the day of your first, or what was the first day of your last period? And then they estimate ovulation based off of that. So if you use the higher standard, which is based on your blood work, there's no difference. So the high quality studies all point to a consistent picture. And this is something like Planned Parenthood endorses. This is something that I would expect FDA to endorse. There's enough evidence there for me. However, Plan B has it on the front page of their
Yeah.
website, so I can't get too angry at the pharmacist, even though I want to.
To
I
Tan.
want to be angry. I can't fault the pharmacist for trusting the
Yeah.
the insert for the medication. I would say that given that it was an assumption when Plan B first came out that it would prevent a fertilized egg from implanting, but that's not true. That the statistics just don't back that up
Mm.
from high quality studies. I think that it should be revised. It's also something where the Catholic Church has reviewed the evidence as well, and they also say it's not an abortifacient, that it doesn't cause a fertile or an implanted egg to be lost or
Well,
anything. And Kotaku does ask if Plan B and Ella are just megadoses of progesterone. There might be some estrogen in there, but I'm pretty sure it's just a megadose of progesterone. And as I said on the other stream, that prevents ovulation. Progesterone is progestational. It's
Well,
good. It rises in
I would
women.
take slight fault at the logical conclusion there potentially because like because certain drugs have certain effects at certain ranges, so it might very well
Mhm.
be that the normal amount that's a normal birth control has the effect of preventing an egg from being spawned, and nothing more. But I don't know that necessarily follows that the large doses that are used in Plan B has only that effect and nothing more. It might have additional effects beyond that, despite the fact the lower dose doesn't have those effects. So I,
Yeah, and in fact, I would say that that's a very astute observation that low doses of progesterone don't prevent ovulation. They just change the cervix and the uterine
yeah, so
lining, but
there you
large
go.
doses do prevent ovulation.
Okay.
So it's really fun to tell women which progesterone only form of birth control actually prevents ovulation or not.
Yes, fair enough.
Um, yeah,
So I think, I don't know enough to render on the legal elements about what's going on in terms of the laws that are available or not for this pharmacist to deny or not. I do take a bit of exception to them actively lying. And
yeah.
like, that does like, it's not lying is bad. And I do tend to be a lot more I haven't gone full fat Kant yet on this, but Kant with categorical imperatives and like basically never lying is very appealing to me. I feel like it's somewhere between rule-based utilitarianism and categorical imperialism has tend to be where I philosophically lie. So I do take exception at the active deception or the active
Ooh,
lie. Well, if they said they can't help you and they said exactly opposite, that's the lie. That's not even a deception. So I do take exception
yeah.
at that.
Um, there is one thing that I promised someone in chat that I was going to bring up.
Sure.
Somebody was asking for the pharmacist if they are found to have done something legally wrong, can the pharmacy be held accountable? So that's CVS, or is it just the pharmacist themselves as an individual?
Well, like all good things, it depends. But the legal theory is respondeat superior. Because you're an
Yes.
employee, yeah, respondeat superior is your legal theory, and say, well, the employer is responsible for the acts of the employee. Now, that is somewhat constrained because it has to be in line with the employment as it relates to official training, official manuals, official things. It can't go so far as like because the pharmacist punched the customer in the face. That necessarily means that the employer is liable, right? Because they probably didn't train them to do that. So like you're looking to things that are within the scope of the employment, and you look to training practices and things of that nature. Also, just by way of legal aside, I believe in some states that the pharmacist is legally independent from like the place like CVS. Like they're not really an employee there; they work there, but I think in some places they are not an employee really necessarily. That they're in some sort of weird nebulous independent status. So there's that too. That would apply. So maybe would be the answer to this question, I suppose.
So, one of the facts of this case was that he had refused to provide this prescription before, and that the pharmacy was aware of this issue, and that he wasn't going to be, that they weren't going to do anything to compensate this particular woman, but that they were going to try to avoid it in the future.
Mm-hmm.
To me, that would increase the
Sure.
culpability of the pharmacy itself because it's a problem that they're aware of
Exactly
and
correct.
it's
Active
predictable.
knowledge. Yep, that definitely factors into this. Of course, definitely yes. So liability for pharmacy would be increased as a potential result to the degree that they're an employee and other things. But yes, I agree with you fully. So yeah,
Um,
so that
one
was
of
an
the
informative discussion.
Yeah. Sorry that I shouted when you said respondeat superior because somebody at one point, because the person who had asked the question, like, oh, well, is the pharmacist or is the pharmacy responsible for the pharmacist? And I said, I think they are. There's a fancy Latin term for it. I'm going to get Blackleaf to say it. And I didn't have to ask you what the fancy term was. You just said it
Oh man,
immediately.
now I feel so used and exploited. I feel dirty inside.
So I shouted yes because like I won bingo. I got you to say it.
I'm not playing with you anymore.
Yeah.
Are there any other things I could do for you, tactical other phrases you want me to say to punch your card?
Um, I would say explain Alice, but we've already done
No, that's okay.
that
Well, yeah,
stream
it's good. Yeah,
before.
yeah. Hmm.
Oh goodness. Yeah, so Smuckers is saying, why would it make any sense that we know he did it before, but now we're gonna try to make sure he won't do it again now? And I believe that would be the legal argument that since they've had this situation before and it has not resolved itself,
Hmm.
or not resolved itself, that the pharmacy has not adequately resolved it. Um, that would increase the responsibility
Sure.
in my mind. As I am not a lawyer, I am not a judge, I am not on a jury. I'm
Yes.
just a talking head in the corner of
Yeah.
the screen.
And Manitoba asked, could the pharmacy lose their license to the extent that it's not, to the extent that it's a violation of the license or pharmacy ethics or violation of state law potentially? But again, you're down to like issues of like, this is explicitly allowed for by state law and what are the contours of it? Some states allow for exactly this, and so presumably it's not a violation of the pharmacy code, although not necessarily. So you'd have to look further, and maybe maybe is the answer
Yeah,
to this and pretty much every other legal question. Maybe, could be, possible. Yes.
yeah. And so when you have a licensing body um, that is independent from the government, so it's not the government that grants you a license, such as like with driving. Instead, you have a private body that regulates its licensing. So, for example, like lawyers or doctors or pharmacists, in order for that person to lose that license, it usually has to go through that regulatory body, not necessarily the
Yes.
court. So
No.
if
Yeah.
this
No.
woman won a civil suit against the pharmacist, it is unlikely, in my non-lawyerly opinion, that the judge would demand that the pharmacist lose their license.
No. Not.
Instead,
It's not. It's not a thing. I've
yeah,
sometimes seen in criminal cases where they put it as a condition of a plea deal, where to give up a license, but short of that, like the judge doesn't have any authority over it. So you get to go to jail and still be doctor, lawyer, pharmacist until the regulatory board, takes away your license. So congratulations, I guess. Yeah.
yeah, so you would have to submit a separate complaint to the regulatory body. And I think this is something that came up with Hook. So the Baker v. Allstate, where the lawyer was going on very profanity laced expletives against Allstate, and Allstate wanted the case dismissed
Not one of the finer
as a
moments I've ever
sanction.
seen.
And so somebody asked, is Hook, i.e., the lawyer that misbehaved, is he going to be disbarred? And it's like,
Probably not
well,
disbarred, but I think he's going to get a public reprimand for it.
yeah. So there are three. Well, there's a couple sources of sanctions. So the judge can sanction within that case.
Yeah.
So that could be monetary sanctions or procedural sanctions, such as dismissing the case, which I hope he doesn't do because now the clients have
Yeah.
stood up and said, like, whoa, this was not what we wanted. This is appalling. We got new counsel.
Yeah.
Hook is gone. Please don't punish us. Then another source of sanctions would be a complaint to the bar, and especially because the clients didn't approve it. I think that there's a strong case for a bar complaint, and then the bar gets to do an investigation, find out, is this a pattern of behavior or is he having a little bit of a breakdown? And maybe he needs to go get some counseling. And then the third source, I believe some courts have their own grievance body that you can be referred to the court's grievance committee or whatever it is.
Well, I think that's only applicable where the court itself is the licensing authority. For example, federal court, that would pop up. So if you're admitted to, like, say, if the Eastern District of New York, to pick out a random example, then they are the licensing authority. So you'd have to be suspended from the practice as far as the Eastern District of New York is concerned. Then, yeah, you could refer it to your own disciplinary committee because you are the licensing authority for that purpose. So that would make sense.
Yeah, I believe that in Leibowitz's case, that the judge referred him to the court's grievance body. So the courthouse itself sort of had or
Right,
that
right, right. That would make total
district itself
sense.
had it.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
would make total sense because they're the one that issued the license in the first place.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So there would be 3 sources of sanctions there, and of course, a 4th could potentially be to for the clients to civilly sue the the lawyer for his misconduct, and then if he has, malpractice insurance, then they could get a payout for that. So I guess that's kind of a form of sanction that they could personally civilly sue him.
Cool. Well, do you have
Am I
anything
missing
more on
any?
a? No, I think you got it pretty well down.
Okay, I feel
So
smart. Thank you,
you
teacher. Do I
you
get a
you
gold star?
yes, you get a gold star, sure. Do
Yay!
you have anything more on the pharmacist story? Did we fail to cover anything, or should we move on to other topics?
I feel oh, there's one other thing that
Sure.
I just sort of wanted to say that I don't think that we kind of covered, and that is employment equity. That that if you are a religious person or you have certain personal beliefs that are very valued, then you still want to have the opportunity to have a job in your preferred sector. And so the example of reasonable accommodation that I'm going to use is a grocery store. Um, so if I am Muslim or I am Jewish or whatever, and I don't want to handle pork products, but I still want to work at a grocery store, then the reasonable accommodation would be for me to say, I don't want to work the deli counter because over half of the orders that come through are going to be for pork products. Can you stick me on cash? Can you stick me on fresh produce? Can I wear gloves if I'm expected to handle pork products? And then so you can find a place within that system in which you're able to do your job. You're not saying I want to be employed by the grocery store, but the grocery store can't have a deli counter because that's against my religious belief. Like that's silly, and nobody's saying that. So you find what is a reasonable accommodation for your beliefs. I think that it would be inappropriate for the grocery store to say, well, all of our employees are always expected to be able to handle any station, and we're going to assign you to whatever station we want when we want, and therefore you have to be okay handling the deli, and you have to be okay handling pork products, and you have to eat pork products so that you can sell it to the customers. That to me would be a little iffy because it's like, well, is that reasonable, and what segment of the population are you going to be excluding from that job?
Mm-hmm.
But in the case of pharmacists, dispensing birth control and hormonal products, like that's a big part of the job. So as much as I want reasonable accommodation for people who are Catholic, for people who have religious beliefs one way or another, or even just deeply held personal beliefs, maybe you had an abortion in the past and you really regret it and you don't want to be part of that. Like it's very distressing for you to be part of that for somebody else. Um, you ask the question, is there a reasonable accommodation here in which the patient or the client or the customer is not going to be negatively affected, but you can also do the other 99% of the job that you're capable of doing? And
Very
I'm
good.
not sure. I'm This still feels like a predictable situation in which the pharmacy should have been aware, and I believe they were aware, and should have accommodated like had a plan for accommodation ahead of time.
Fair enough. Well, with that being said, I think we will stop this discussion and we will move on to legal stories